Hello. Okay, for our science final, we are doing a video summary of learning, and I have my sheet with the questions about what we are required to answer, the prompts. So if I'm looking down, that's what I'm reading. So the first question is explain what a misconception is and how it relates to the science instruction. So a misconception is an idea that a bunch of people think is correct, but it is not correct. This can be, we talked about it in our science class whenever we did our interviews with our practicum students, and the probe that I chose to do was the non-living things and living things. And a lot of my kiddos thought that just because they didn't have a heartbeat, that means that they aren't living. Another example that some of my friends had been talking about is deciding if clay sinks or floats whenever you change its shape. And misconceptions are important because it really sets the students up to fail. And in our science methods class, Alberto had us put a bunch of paper clips in a small cup filled with water to see how many paper clips it took for the cup to overflow. And a lot of us didn't think it was going to do many paper clips to take it to overflow, but since we were set up to fail, now we are able to remember the material better. So I think that it's really important to help our kids remember the material better, because usually when you're wrong, you remember that, because a lot of people don't like to be wrong. So how can I set up misconceptions in my future classroom? Building on previously when I was talking about the non-living and living things, how a lot of kids think that if you don't have a heartbeat, then you're not living, which I mean makes sense because they know that people, like if I didn't have a heartbeat, then I wouldn't be living. Well, we could go outside and I can show them that just because a tree doesn't have a heartbeat, we could listen for a heartbeat. And just because they don't have a heartbeat, that doesn't mean that they're not living, because they're still growing and eating and just doing other things that a living person does as well, but just doesn't have a heartbeat. So we can find other examples, like maybe a flower, and prove that it's like absorbing the sunlight and growing. And just because they don't have a heartbeat doesn't mean it's not living. So that would create the aha moment and hopefully stick with them. The next subject is the progression of the standards. So it says to explain the term progression of standards. So the progression of standards is you take one specific standard in like kindergarten and you build upon it in like third grade, and like each grade just builds upon the standard previously. So for example, this is PSI.A, structure of matter. And in K through 2, the matter exists as a different substances that have observable different properties. And then in 3 through 5, they build on that, and they say matter exists as particles that are too small to see, and so matter is always conserved even if it seems to disappear. And then that would be the next grade building upon that would be middle school. And it says the fact that matter is composed of atoms and molecules can be used to explain the properties of substances, diversity of materials, states of matter, phase change, and conservation of matter. So each grade level builds upon the previous grade level and makes it more complex, but they're still activating their prior knowledge by saying maybe like, oh, remember in kindergarten when we were first taught that matter has different observable properties, and then like they build on it each year to make the properties more complex to observe. So it says, what is the purpose of NGSS? This is really to keep everything in line, and like the previous teacher kind of knows or expects what the other kids know because of like their previous grade level. So if they're in 3rd grade, then they can build on what the standard says that they should know in 2nd grade. So they can activate their prior knowledge and then kind of move on towards the more complex of the 3rd grade level they're supposed to be in. As a 5th grade teacher focused on teaching content related to this specific category of the PSIA, so my goal as a teacher would be to make sure that my kids know how to identify the property of matters in like a different way, such as color or texture and so on. As a teacher, I can come up with investigations for them to test these, and they would need evidence to back up their properties, such as like maybe a measurement of weight. So the entire like overall goal, I'd say, or to sum up the standard in my own words, would to be they would need evidence to back up their measurement of the different materials they identified in different ways. So, okay, moving on to the 5E learning cycle. So there are 5 stages of the 5E instructional cycle. It is engage, explore, explain, elaborate, and evaluate. So with that being said, some things in the engage section the teacher would explain the concepts. They would lecture maybe, they would create interest, they would generate curiosity. This would raise questions for the students to ask, and this would also identify what the students would know. So on the students' other hand, they would be asking questions like, why does this happen? What do I already know about this subject? They'd really just show interest in the subject. So the next stage is the explore phase. And this really encourages students to work together. This can be like asking questions to redirect the students as investigating when necessary. This is kind of the time where they set up to fail when we were talking about the misconceptions earlier. The students really are thinking freely, and they're testing their predictions and hypothesis, and they're really just recording observation and ideas, trying to really get the whole gist of this. The next stage is the explain stage. So this is the teacher would be asking for evidence of like why things happen. This is where they would introduce definitions, explanations, and new labels. This is when the student or the teachers use the student's previous experiences for really explaining the concepts. So this is really all about explaining like what's going on and like what's happening, so the students can realize what's going on. The students are questioning the other explanations, and they are really referring to the previous activities. Whenever we were talking about how the teacher activates on previous activities, they're sitting here thinking about, oh, okay, like this relates back to the other activity we did. So it's really building on their prior knowledge as well. The elaborate phase is when you're really connecting something that like what you did in the project and connecting it like elsewhere. So for an example, in our 5E lesson plan, we did the pumpkin life cycle. So we asked the students to create a sentence about where they are in their life related to the pumpkin life cycle. So the students would create a sentence like, I am the sprout because I'm still a little child, or whatever. They just had to explain like what's going on. So the students are really applying their new information to other real life situations or other experiments that they have done. The evaluate, this is whenever you're testing to see what your kids know. The teachers are looking for evidence that the kids have learned something. So the students are, they're answering questions. They're usually open-ended questions, so it's not just like a true or false kind of thing. They have to explain and be able to really prove that they know the information. So moving on from the 5E life cycle is the engineering design process. This was one of my favorite things to talk about in class because it was very fun to just learn about it. So the engineering design process, otherwise known as EIE, the engineering in elementary. So an activity that we did in our science methods classes was the robots, and we had to, plan like how we're gonna make the robots and stuff like that. But the whole cycle, it is a cycle. The first stage is ask, and then imagine, plan, create, and improve. Improvement is where the deepest learning takes place, and it's the deepest because you go back and think of which ways you can make the whatever you're designing better. And it's kind of convenient because this is also the most skipped stage that happens. So an example of how it happens so frequently, of why it's skipped or why people just kind of forget to do it, is because in our class we didn't have time we ran out of time, so we couldn't make improvements to our robots to make them better. But as future teachers, we really need to plan accordingly, so we allow our students that time for deeper thinking, because that is a very important step with the EIE. So the next questions, what assignment did you feel was most helpful and impactful? So I really think that the 5E lesson plan was the most helpful. The 5E lesson plan was the most helpful because we got to really, we did it with our practicum partners, but then that helped us build our unit plan. And we really were introduced how to make our science plans better with the 5E. It was very helpful, and we can take that into our future classrooms for sure. The assignment that I felt was not helpful or impactful, I really think that a lot of the students a lot of the assignments we did for a reason, but I don't know, I feel like they're all very impactful or helpful, but maybe the foldable, because all we really did was just we just walked around the room and judged whose was the most creative, which was fine. We learned how to make foldables, but then we didn't really do anything with them except for include them in our unit plan. But again, I really think that everything was impactful. I think that's the end of my video. Thank you for a great semester, and I look forward to seeing you at Bluemont.